at the middle ground. Springtime has come. A lot has happened in the last year politically. And since I haven't done very many videos during last year's campaign or elections, there's a lot to cover. I did want to make this video particularly about a political update from Georgia. And I think it would probably help to give an overview of what does it mean to be a moderate voter in Georgia. Because I know that that's my platform and I talk a lot about my position being a moderate voter in Georgia and how that informs my voting decisions and my policy interests and decisions as well. I did grow up in a household with parents that were both card-carrying Republicans. However, they are not social conservatives. They would describe themselves as fiscal conservatives. That means in terms of fiscal policy, they do not support platforms that drift towards socialism. They support platforms that stay on a continuity more of a free market. And I would say I have not seen the Republican Party supporting the policy ideology that my parents say that they claim, or other conservatives as well, because I know it could be a whole different video topic about economic policy of the Republican Party not supporting free markets, not supporting competition, and how conservatives and Republicans have undermined competition and taken away regulations that prevent monopolies. So there's a lot of economic policies, I would say, as a moderate voter from a family that's our fiscal conservatives, that I do not see the Republican Party supporting. My parents have never been social conservatives. And in terms of that means they have friends who have been gay for decades. They are not, do not take extreme positions against women, for example. They don't necessarily believe that women, certain gender norms need to be supported. When I was younger, they always told me that in terms of my romantic or love life, whoever I met and chose, they would support, regardless of race, gender. So that's a big difference in terms of being moderate, but wanting to see fiscally conservative policies and trying to support a party that claims to represent those, but not being a hardliner social conservatives. That would describe my more moderate household in terms of, because we have so much history in politics in Georgia and my father's family's side, we talked about politics growing up from the time I was little, because my parents are both very politically engaged. My father has always helped campaign, and I'll get into that in a minute. So I would say that I was raised with the understanding that you wanted to vote for competent representation. So whether in our state representatives or our federal representatives, the people that we wanted to vote for had their act together, but also understood the needs and the values of the community that they were going to represent. Obviously, there's been a lot of shift in demographics in the community where my parents live, but that's generally speaking the goal in terms of our voting decisions. I have obviously been on my own path growing up and made my own voting decisions based potentially on other social factors throughout my life, but that's the environment and the political conversation that I grew up around. Certainly a little bit more libertarian in nature, as well as my father has campaigned for Democrats, has crossed over in primaries when he's seen a Democratic candidate even in neighboring constituencies that seem to be more competent, seem to have their act together, versus a candidate that was loud and a rabble rouser. We have that's a thing in Georgia, and grandstanders. So as Georgia moderate conservative voters in Georgia, we're not big fans of grandstanding. We are fans of getting the job done. And I think in the book that I'm writing, particularly about some of the tone-deaf nature of the national conversation, Northern liberals being a bit tone-deaf for the Georgia voting demographics. One big topic that I cover in my book is the difference between the federal and the state boundaries. So in Georgia, in some of the neighboring states who have similar economies, there's still a lot of agriculture, very interdependent. With South Carolina, we have the coastal economy as well. So in this region, there are similar economic factors that these states consider. So when we elect federal representation in terms of senators, then it is in keeping with the economic needs of the state, which are not the same as New York, New England. I have a friend that I was talking with recently about some of my work and groundbreaking and pioneering overhaul, working with my friend Jamie Harrison with the Democratic Party throughout the last election, with the language used to stop losing elections in Georgia, for example. So my friend recently, who lives in New York, was observing to me that she's traveled through other states in the country, other parts of the country, and notice it's a completely different lifestyle than New England, New York, where the population density is much higher. In other states where people live 2 miles apart, she said no wonder they thought these mask mandates nationally were insane, because they live 2 miles apart and they're not going to see anybody and they don't need to wear a mask. So she could understand that in terms of different lifestyles in New York versus other states in the country, national policies don't always make sense for both those different communities. I said, of course, in New York, where everyone's living on top of each other, you want everybody to be healthy, and potentially makes more sense that you would want your tax money to go toward healthcare for other people, versus other parts of the country where there are just different priorities, different ideas about how the community comes together, what the burden should be on taxpayers in terms of other social responsibilities, very different factors in terms of economic policies and decisions that a representative from Georgia would make about the state of Georgia compared to the rest of the Democratic Party, largely setting national policy driven by liberals in New York. So that's a big theme of my book. Hopefully it will come out in the next couple of years. I look forward to the adventure of putting this together and sharing in depth all of my experience. So in terms of recent Georgia politics, there's been a bunch of elections in the last year since I started this channel. I was this week, and so periodically talk with my father about our new representatives. We have 2 new senators from the Democratic Party who have been in office just over 2 years. My father sometimes doesn't hear a lot about them, so he's always inquiring if I have. So we frequently discuss just reviewing their representation of the state of Georgia and their performance. In the fall, I was considering and asked to run in the Georgia 14th Congressional District. The reason being because the Speaker of the House for the state of Georgia was David Ralston, and we have family ties to him. So he's from Blue Ridge, which is the Georgia 14th Congressional District after it was redistricted. And he's heavily influential in those communities. My family has been involved in that community for decades. We own land there. I grew up in those communities. Very hardworking people. And so in the fall, I was going to sit down with David Ralston and discuss his support to run for Congress in that district, obviously being introduced, all the chambers of commerce, having thorough discussions about the interests of those communities, what economic growth priorities they had, what they wanted to see in terms of congressional representation, because clearly they deserve a lot better than they currently have. At the time in the fall, my father was not paying much attention to Congressman Greene. So he was less interested in that discussion that I was having about her, how embarrassing she is for Georgia voters. However, in the past 6 months, he has started paying a lot more attention and is incredibly embarrassed and does not consider her to be somebody who deserves, that Georgia voters deserve representation that's much more competent and much more together than she is. So that's something that he and I have in common. So in terms of Marjorie Taylor Greene, I was asked to run against her for Congress. I was going to discuss the support from David Ralston, but sadly David Ralston had serious health concerns and passed away last November, just before Thanksgiving. And it's a great loss to the Georgia community. He has been a very strong leader who has mentored many great politicians in the Georgia legislature. He has been provided so much consistency for the state of Georgia in the last several decades. Obviously, I have memories of him as a child, and so he's, in my view, been somebody who's been someone to look up to, and it's a very sad loss for the state of Georgia that he has passed away so young. That did, for the time being, close the door on my congressional run against Marjorie Taylor Greene. However, her performance in terms of representing those communities is pitiful. I am flabbergasted by how little she knows about basic elementary school subject matter like math and history. Almost everything that comes out of her math would not pass standard public education exams in elementary school in that district. And that is not the kind of leader that I want to see the children and the teenagers in that community looking up to, because she's so badly educated and she does such a bad job understanding and representing the needs of those communities. So in terms of the job performance of Marjorie Taylor Greene, her job performance is very low. It's a failing job performance. She gets an F in terms of her job performance, and this is something my father, after the last 6 months of actually paying attention to her, has definitely agreed with me. We are also in the 5th district. We were constituents of John Lewis for a very long time. And sadly, John Lewis was a one-issue representative. We were not happy with the job that he did representing us. We did consider, as a civil rights leader, he did have a wonderful impact globally, spreading his experience in the education about civil rights. But we did feel that that could be separated from his position in Congress. And so we were wishing that the Democratic Party would give us a new representative in Congress. Also, John Lewis has passed away recently, which is also a loss. He has been a great civil rights leader in his own right, even though we did not consider his job as a representative in Congress, particularly toward the end of his career, to be as strong as we would have liked as his constituents. Our new Congressman, Nikema Williams, was elected to fill his seat. And in terms of my communication with my congresswoman as her constituent, I have been communicating a lot of my support and my interests for her to represent me in limiting any influence Marjorie Taylor Greene has because of her poor performance. So I know that Congressman Williams has been representing my interests and my communication to her as her constituent in terms of the Georgia delicacy and her balancing out the really embarrassing and negative impact that Marjorie Taylor Greene is having representing Georgia. That moves us to the two senators, and my father has asked me several times for updates about the senators, and one of them was recently had his reelection campaign. Senator Warnock was reelected for a full term this past fall. In the last 2 years, I have seen a lot more attention and publicity about Senator Ossoff, and he has been doing a great job in terms of priorities for Georgia's economy. He has worked very hard to consolidate deals for new businesses, new manufacturing in Georgia, new renewable electric vehicle, battery storage, industries growth in Georgia, and the creations of thousands of jobs in rural parts of Georgia, not in the urban centers. So in terms of working with the needs of Georgia communities to strengthen and build the economies, Senator Ossoff gets a high job performance review. I have heard less about Senator Warnock. My understanding about Senator Warnock is that he has been keeping his head down and working hard for community members. Senators do have to do a lot of constituent representation. Having worked for a senator, I have done a lot of this work myself. Senators work with other federal agencies, including Veterans Affairs, as well as immigration issues. So constituents who are in need and having trouble navigating some of the federal agencies can contact their senators for assistance. So my understanding is that Senator Warnock has been doing an excellent job in terms of constituent care. In terms of the bigger picture and bigger deals, bigger policy decisions, in terms of his representation of Georgia, I have just heard less about. However, he did have a re-election campaign where he got to talk a lot about his policies. And last summer, the topic of abortion was a very big topic nationally that the Democratic Party was using. I did make it clear that that national conversation would potentially alienate Georgia voters. And this has been an ongoing topic with the Democratic National Convention, which nearly cost Biden's win in Georgia in 2020, with some of the more progressive, loud slogans that were being yelled, which Georgia voters strongly feel that if those ideologies that are so foreign to anything Georgia voters care about, they do not want to vote for members of the party to support those ideologies. You can read a lot about this topic in the book I'm writing about my work with the Democratic Party. But I did notice, my father did ask me, in contrast to the conservative leadership, which I've expressed extreme concern and disgruntled reaction to the lack of leadership I see on the conservative side. My father has asked me, what would that look like? What would leadership look like to me from conservatives? I said, to me, because my father was a naval officer, he understands leadership. And to me, leadership is helping people overcome their fears and move forward and find solution-oriented strategies. And I do not see any of that from conservative leadership in response to big concerns and fears you see expressed and exploited, propaganda about fears and concerns in the conservative communities that get blown out of proportion. And the response from conservative leadership is to feed into it rather than address it and overcome those fears and concerns. So in terms of growing up with a father who understands leadership as a military officer, I don't see leadership on the conservative side. That's something I've discussed with him in depth. So he asked me, well, what about Black community leaders? How would you say they compare to what you see in your criticism of conservative leaders? So I mentioned the topic of abortion. I said, well, I can quote Senator Warnock from his re-election campaign last summer. He talked at one point about having experience counseling women in his congregation who were facing crisis pregnancies and had severe factors putting pressure on them. And that he had that experience of being there for them without judgment, without telling them what to do. So the subtext that I heard from him, in contrast with many conservative Christian leaders and pastors in church communities, is that he's providing a church community that is a safe space for women who need support facing stressful and traumatic decisions in their life regarding pregnancies, and that he was not participating in the conservative narrative that women are evil. Because you can read about that in depth in my book, what it's like to be inside of these conversations on the conservative side around these ideologies around reproduction and abortion. So I saw a big contrast in him describing a community that he leads that provides support and judgment-free love for the women in those communities, regardless of what considerations or decisions they may face. And to me, that looks more like leadership. So those are some reviews of some of the players that people see nationally representing the state of Georgia. Obviously, nationally, there was a lot of interest in our governor race last summer, where we had a rematch between Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams, and I was honestly very surprised with how it went. Stacey Abrams is an incredible successful political operative, and we expected once that campaign began in the summer that she was going to make it very difficult for Brian Kemp to compete, just as she did last time. Brian Kemp avoided some of the errors from his previous campaign. In his first campaign for governor, he released a very tasteless campaign video with a rifle about rounding up bad hombres. Obviously, in 2018, Donald Trump was a lot more popular in the political sphere than he was in 2020. But Brian Kemp got a lot of criticism for that racist campaign video, and he did not veer into that territory again. He was coming off of fairly successful economic handling of the pandemic, And that created some context for Stacey Abrams to make some statements that really hurt her. At one point, I think she made a statement about Georgia being a terrible place to live. And I think that really undermined her chances of success. Brian Kemp, in one statement or video that was released, mentioned that if Stacey Abrams did not like Georgia, she could go back to where she's from, and that was a reference to her not being born in Georgia, but being born in the Midwest. That is actually a very common attitude of people from Georgia and the South. My father has spent his whole life in the Southeast, apart from being in the Navy, and obviously that involved a lot of world travel. But his attitude, particularly because the population in Atlanta has increased significantly from people migrating from northern climates, particularly New York, and complaining about the heat in Atlanta. So for many years, for decades, my father's attitude was that if they're going to complain about it, then they are welcome to go back from where they came from. That Georgia doesn't need New York overcrowding. So that's a pretty standard par for the course attitude in Georgia is that if you're going to complain about it instead of love it, and you're not from Georgia, that you know where the door is. So, but I think Stacey Abrams really hurt herself in taking that position. Lastly, of course, Senator Warnock was up against Hershel Walker, which received a lot of criticism. I can observe that there was still a lot of disconnect from Northern liberals in understanding Hershel Walker's popularity. I would say that Hershel Walker was a very problematic candidate. You might all enjoy this anecdote, this conversation I had with my father this week. So, something about me that provides context is that I do not watch college football, except for Yale football. I do not watch the NFL. I do not participate in fantasy leagues football. I follow 0 players in any football league, apart from European soccer leagues. So I live in a cave in relation to news about football players. However, because Hershel Walker is such a popular football player in Georgia, years ago, decades ago, I heard stories about him being violent toward women. I heard that as somebody who does not follow any news about football players. Big goose egg is the amount of news stories or careers that I follow for football players. And that's something I heard loud and clear and knew about. And my mother probably talked to me about it at the time when those news stories were coming out about Hershel Walker, because he was such a popular Georgia football player. So if I know that, and I can remember it from decades ago, as soon as I saw him become a candidate for Senate, I said, this will be easy for Democrats to win. My father said that the person that recommended Hershel Walker didn't know that story. So to me, that blows my mind that Hershel Walker's candidacy was built around how everybody had followed his career for decades and how popular he was for being such a great, successful football player. So they followed every story from his career, and somehow they missed all of these big stories about his violence against women, and I followed 0 stories about his career. And I can remember those, the only thing I know about him from 10 years ago. And that is astounding to me. And that is the kind of issues that I'm having with the Georgia Republican Party and that level of incompetence in choosing who they want to represent us. So I do not understand or know all of the reasons why Hershel Walker was promoted as a Senate candidate for Georgia. I did know off the bat that he had a problem with violence against women, and that was going to cost him the election. And it should cost him the election, and my father's pretty sure on some level that it did. My father has done voter analysis and compared the trends for how voters split gender-wise for the governor's election versus the Senate election, and the women were the difference. So my father said, absolutely, women are the reason that Hershel Walker lost that election. But that said, the other part of him, the part aside from all of those problems that I knew were going to undermine his success in candidacy, the other part is his popularity. And that's the part that Northern liberals criticize because they do not understand that that is the Georgia political culture. In terms of his popularity, and they would criticize that he would go to these big companies and talk to their employees as part of his campaign tour, and he would tell these stories because that is the Georgia political culture. So there was a huge disconnect between any Northern liberals understanding Georgia political culture and the popularity of Hershel Walker and thinking that was the reason he shouldn't win. And that is tone deaf. So this has been my overview for recent Georgia politics, review of all of the representatives we have, high and low, and some of the decisions that we've made in the last year since I started this channel. I hope that this gives you an insight into what to me it means to me to be a moderate voter, the concerns and considerations and conversations we have in Georgia as moderate voters. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day.